Today, we're going to have a look at a mod that gives a modern twist to Create. The mod is Create Diesel Generators, and it brings Create from the Steam Age to the modern age. It does this by adding some new power sources that require some new fuels, as well as interesting ways of obtaining them. Overall, this is a focused mod that does what it's meant to do very well. Let's start by having a look at the different types of diesel generators. So the diesel engine can be placed either vertically or horizontally. When it's placed vertically like this, you can enter the fuel by the sides, but when you place it horizontally, you have to enter the fuel by the bottom. Now the engines will start running as soon as they receive their fuel. You don't have to crank them. So diesel engines can actually run on a wide variety of fuels, but for these examples, I'll be using only diesel unless otherwise stated. So we can see that typically the engines provide 96 RPM, and with diesel, we have 3072 stress units. So the engines can be quite noisy, though now you'll notice there's no sound. That's because I've applied a silencer to the engine. If I right click with my wrench, I can take off the silencer and you can hear the engine turning. I can simply add the silencer by right clicking the engine. We can also add a turbocharger to the engine, but to do so we have to first remove the silencer. When I add the turbocharger, you'll notice the speed of the engine doubles. I'll put back the silencer because the engines are quite noisy. Next, let's have a look at the modular diesel engine. So not only are the modular diesel engines more powerful than the standard diesel engines, you only have to feed fuel to the first modular diesel engine. So they don't all have to be connected to the fuel source. So here we can right click it to either allow or not allow fuel to enter it. And you'll see if I destroy this and then I go ahead and place another diesel engine, well, it'll automatically start running even though it's not receiving any fuel directly, it's receiving fuel from the other modular engines. So I can add a silencer to the modular diesel engines, but if I remove it, I cannot add a turbocharger. So that's one of the trade-offs of using modular diesel engines. You can't speed them up using turbochargers, but they allow you to have a more compact design that has more stress units. So to illustrate the difference between the modular diesel engines and the standard diesel engines, I've set up 3 standard diesel engines, but I've only given fuel to one of them, and we'll see that we have 3000 stress units being produced. And if I add some fuel pipes, you'll see that number increase for each additional engine that I give fuel to. So the modular engines only require one of them to receive fuel, but the standard ones require all of them to receive fuel. Next, let's have a look at the huge diesel engine. So what sets the huge diesel engine apart from the other two is that it's both faster and more powerful. It also takes up more space because you have to connect a shaft to it or else it will not run. So here I'm adding some shafts to the diesel engines, and you can see that they will connect to the shaft and start moving. Each of the huge diesel engines requires fuel. So you'll see we get a lot of stress and a lot of speed from the huge diesel engines. Here's how you would go about setting up a diesel engine. So you'd set your fluid tank and then fill it up with some fuel. I'm using a diesel bucket. By the way, if you go into your inventory and hold Alt over the diesel bucket or any other fuel, you can see the stats for that fuel based on the engine that you use it in. So what I would do is I would add a mechanical pump and then a fluid pipe. I'd add my diesel generator on top and then a cog here to pump fluid into the engine. I'd turn the pump around with a wrench and then add a crankshaft. So once you have this set up, make sure to change the direction of the engine, otherwise it'll break. Simply turn the crankshaft and now you have a self-sustaining engine. We can add a silencer to it by right-clicking, and we'll put a stressometer and a speedometer to look at the speed and stress produced by the engine. So that's how you make yourself a basic engine setup. So now what about the fuels? Well, there's a few kinds. So you have biodiesel, diesel, gasoline, plant oil, and ethanol. And of course, you have crude oil that you use to get the diesel and the gasoline. So in Create Diesel Generators, we get oil out of the ground by using an oil pump. But first, we have to detect the oil by using an oil detector. So what the oil detector does is it tells us if there's oil in the chunk or not. I'm going to press F3 plus G to show the chunk borders, and that's going to make it easier for us to find oil. So now obviously there's oil in this chunk because I have an oil pump. If I right click on the oil detector, it'll say that it found some oil. But let's go into another chunk to see if we can't find another place that has oil. Alright, so we finally found some oil, so now we can build ourselves our oil pump. I've gone ahead and prepared a schematic of an oil pump, and I'll leave a link to it in the description of the video. So what we have to do is we have to make sure that the head of our oil pump, this part here, is in the chunk that has the oil. So I'll go ahead and move the schematic so that that part of the pump is within the chunk. Okay, so we still have to do a few things. I'll set this one up and then I'll show you how to build one step by step. The oil pump has a bearing that needs to be assembled. There's a special bearing called the pump jack bearing. I'll simply right click on that and we'll see that the pump jack assembles itself. So there's also the pump jack crank right here. And if I supply that with rotation, it'll start to pump. You'll notice here I have a message, connection to bedrock is missing. We actually have to connect the pipe down here to bedrock. If we were in survival, we'd have to dig all the way down. But since we're in creative, I'll go ahead and cheat and place a piece of bedrock right here. And you'll see now it said there's an oil amount. So that is the amount of oil that is brought up to the surface. Though we still need to pump it into a tank. So let's set that up. So now we'll see the crude oil start to flow into this fluid container. Make sure that both the oil pump and the mechanical pump are both running, otherwise the oil won't be taken out of the ground. Okay, so let's look at how to build an oil pump step by step. First, we're going to have to use a few special blocks. We're going to have to use the pump jack hole, the pump jack bearing, the pump jack head, and the pump jack crank. So let's start by placing the pump jack hole in the chunk that contains the oil. The pump jack will connect to the top and the pipes will come out of the sides here. Next, we need to place the pump jack bearing. So to do that, let's go back 4 blocks from the pump jack hole. I'm going to build a structure with scaffolding, but really the type of block you use doesn't matter, except for the 4 specialized blocks that we use for the pump jack. I'm going to go ahead and place a block of zinc here. And I'm going to place the pump jack bearing right here. So the pump jack bearing is going to be where the whole pump jack pivots. So for this next part of the pump, I'm going to use some metal girder. So first start off by placing a piece of girder here, and then what we're going to do is we're going to place 3 blocks this way towards the back, and then 2 blocks towards the front. I'm going to place a block of zinc here, and then I'm going to place the pump jack head. So the pump jack head has to be directly above the pump jack hole. Towards the back, I'm going to place a pump jack bearing, and then I'm going to right click on it with my wrench, and that's going to be where the pump jack crank will connect. Next, we place the pump jack crank 3 blocks underneath this bearing. The next step is to glue everything together. Once we've glued everything together, we can simply right click on the pump jack bearing and everything should connect. The next step is to add a power source to the pump jack crank. There's just one problem though, we don't have a connection to bedrock. So let's dig a hole and connect our pump all the way to bedrock. Okay, so I've made it to bedrock and now I'll just place some pipes. The next and final step is to connect the pump jack hole to the fluid tank. So there we go. We're now pumping crude oil from our second pump jack to the fluid tank. So now we know how to get crude oil out of the ground, but how do we transform that into diesel and gasoline? Well, we simply build a distillation tank. So to build a distillation tank, all we have to do is build a normal fluid tank 3 tall and then add a distillation controller to it. The next step is to fill up the distillation tank with crude oil. Then we feed something to the blaze to get it going, and you'll see that we'll start to get some other fluids. We're going to start to get some diesel as well as some gasoline. If I turn off the pumps that are emptying out the distillation tank, we can see that the diesel and the gasoline are accumulating at these respective levels. And of course we have the crude oil in the bottom. So diesel and gasoline are only 2 of the fuels in this mod. There's also ethanol, biodiesel, and plant oil. So if we have a mod like just enough items installed, it'll show us how to acquire each of the fuels. Now let's have a look at the plant-based fuels. So to get ethanol, what we need is a basin as well as a basin lid. Go ahead and place down the basin, and what's important is that we need to put in sugar and bone meal. And what's going to happen is that's going to ferment. But it's not going to ferment just yet. We have to put on the basin lid. So now we'll see that slowly ethanol will be created from the sugar and bone meal. We can then pump this into a tank to use to make biodiesel if we want. The process for creating plant oil is quite simple. We simply put seeds in a basin and use the mechanical press on it. If I activate this, we'll see that the wheat seeds will be crushed and that plant oil will be created. So for every wheat seed that we crush, it seems like we get 100 millibuckets of plant oil. So to make biodiesel, we simply mix everything together in a basin. So you'll see the amount of ethanol will go down and will slowly create some biodiesel. And then of course we pump the biodiesel into its own tank. So that's how we make the plant-based fuels. So why would you want to use one type of fuel over the other? Well, if you go into your inventory and press Alt, you'll see the amount of RPM and stress that it'll create for each engine. So the biodiesel bucket produces a different amount of stress as the diesel bucket, and so on and so forth for all the different types of fuel. I've set up a standard diesel engine with each kind of fuel. So we can see how much stress and how much speed each fuel produces. So for the case of diesel, we can see that we have 3072 stress units along with the standard 96 RPM. Next, if we look at biodiesel, we can see that it produces 2048 stress units. And if we look at gasoline, we can see that it also produces 2048 stress units. Next is plant oil, and plant oil is particular because though it produces 2048 stress units, it's the only one that produces a different RPM. It produces 74 RPM instead of 96 RPM. And finally we have ethanol, which produces a measly 1024 stress units. And it's true that ethanol does produce less power. So when you go to the gas station and you fill up your car and there's ethanol in the gas, they're watering down your gas essentially because ethanol produces less power per unit of volume. At least it still gives us 96 RPM. So there you have it. That was the core features of Create diesel generators. And one more thing, Create diesel generators works great with mods that add vehicles like Valkyrien Skies Clockwork and probably also Create Aeronautics. So this is a great mod that has a lot of fun and useful applications. If you're interested, I'll be leaving a link to a schematic of this car in the video description, but you'll have to add your own wheels because I can only add the body of the car as a schematic. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to support me, then please consider subscribing and activating notifications. Thank you for watching.